Good night, everyone. I appreciate you coming out this evening. My name is Sean Reese. I'm the Executive Director for Wyoming Humanities. We have been very happy to develop a partnership with the We the People program. My organization's mission is to strengthen Wyoming's democracy by creating an environment of understanding, wisdom, inspiration, creativity, and idea sharing. And civics and democracy is one of our hallmark initiatives towards that end. We're here tonight to talk about the Constitution, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about humanities and the role of our democracy. And I'll use as an example the Declaration of Independence, which is about to celebrate its 250th anniversary. If you think about the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, it was a document that was formed using history and ethics, classical thought from the Greeks and Romans, religion, linguistics, language. There's even poetry in the Declaration of Independence. If you think of through the course of human events, that denotes a river that humanity is flowing down. And it's very poetic. And not only did the Declaration of Independence use all of these humanities disciplines, it also involved, to a great extent, the democratic process of group writing, which is about compromise and choices and consensus. And it's a wonderful example of the importance of humanities in our society. We believe strongly that an education in civics is important for a strong, healthy democracy. And we believe that We the People program is one of the best ways to understand so many layers of understanding about our Constitution, about the checks and balances, about the branches of government. And we have a lot to learn from the students who are learning about the Constitution. Tonight, we are able to bring to you Dr. David Adler, with whom we have been very blessed to write regular columns that are published statewide, including in the Casper Star Tribune, about the Supreme Court and justices and the history of case law and how those cases are still relevant today. We're very blessed to be able to do that because of wonderful partners such as the L. Bogan Foundation, and I'd like to thank them. We are recording tonight's conversation so that we can help spread this conversation across the state. This is the second in a series of community conversations about the citizen and the Constitution. Conversations that involve students, teachers, experts, and I'd argue we all have something to learn from one another. I would like to introduce the state coordinator for the State We the People program, Matt Stranagan. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks to all of you. I want to echo his sentiments on the support of the John P. L. Bogan Foundation, and many of the people that are here have served as judges and volunteers for us, so it's a network that make this program go. For those that don't know about the We the People program, it's been around since the bicentennial celebration of the U.S. Constitution in 1987. It's in every state and U.S. territory. What I want to give you a brief background on is our format for tonight. With me here tonight is Paula Volker and Sydney Moore. Sydney is a student at Casper Kelly Walsh High School, an advanced placement class. Paula is her teacher. Our role is to ask questions, and we will be asking 6 questions that are from the 6 units of study that Sydney, in December, will have to face professors from the University of Wyoming, judges, scholars, legal experts, and she'll have to testify on her learning in the Wyoming State Capitol, in the hearing room. So this isn't a fly-by-night class. This is a very deep understanding. These students will answer not what are the three branches of government, but tell you the difference between substantive due process and procedural due process. That's not an exaggeration. I saw that, and I saw that from fifth graders involved in this program. That's why I'm involved as a longtime educator and teacher and high school principal. So we will ask questions, but we also want this to be an interactive session. We were in Sheridan 2 nights ago with Dr. Adler, and I found myself listening to him in one of the questions. And in the first unit, I wanted to ask a question, and by unit 6, I had forgotten the question I wanted to ask him. So we want this to be interactive. We'll cover 6 units, 6 very broad areas of the Constitution, and Dr. Adler will answer that question, much like the students will have to do in December. He will have less than 10 minutes to answer that question, and if any point in time, either on how Dr. Adler answers that question or how you perceive the question and something you'd like to say, those are live mics at your tables. We'd like you to pose that question as well. Dr. Adler will field that question, and if there are no other questions of that nature for that particular unit, we'll move to Unit 2. So again, we want this to be interactive. Ask questions as you have them, and we hope this to be a great night. Let me give you a little background on the person that matters tonight. Dr. David Adler. I was conducting an institute 6 years ago, and no, it's longer than that now, 10 years ago in Jackson, Wyoming, the Teton Science School, and I asked people at the Center for Civic Education, which is our organization at civiced.org, who are the best scholars in the country? Because if we're going to bring people to Wyoming, we want to have the best scholars in the country. Of the 6-unit scholars they named, Dr. Adler was one person. Dave has been with us in Jackson. Every year we have it for the last 10 years. When members of this community talked about doing constitutional conversations, they said, who would be the best person to write these editorials? Next answer was the gentleman that will be speaking to you briefly. Dr. David Gray Adler is president of the Alturas Institute, a nonprofit organization created to advance American democracy by promoting the Constitution, civic education, gender equality, and equal protection of the law. A recipient of teaching, writing, and civic awards, Adler has lectured nationally and internationally and published widely on the Constitution, presidential power, and the Bill of Rights. He is the author of 6 books, including most recently The War, Power, in an Age of Terrorism, as well as more than 100 scholarly articles in the leading journals of his field. He is currently writing a book on the landmark Supreme Court decision in Reed v. Reed, which had its origins in Idaho and transformed the law for American women. Adler's scholarly writings have been quoted by the United States Supreme Court, lower federal courts, the U.S. Attorney General, the White House Counsel, the legal advisor to the State Department, by Republicans and Democrats in both houses of Congress, as well as political scientists, historians, and law professors. He has consulted with members of Congress from both parties on a variety of constitutional issues, including impeachment, the war power, and the termination of treaties. He has delivered more than 750 public lectures throughout Idaho and contributes op-ed pieces to newspapers across the nation, including a weekly syndicated newspaper column on the Constitution. Please welcome to Casper, Wyoming, Dr. David Adler.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a pleasure to join all of you tonight. I want to give my heartfelt thanks to the Wyoming Humanities Council, Wyoming PBS, Wyoming We the People, and certainly to the John P. L. Bogan Foundation for its terrific support of civic education throughout Idaho. It's really an honor to join all of you tonight and to take the questions that our students, like Sydney, will be addressing in the state competition. And let me say what a pleasure it is to work with Matt Stranagan as he has organized this statewide tour for the opportunity to help students around the state better understand the Constitution. I want to say that I look forward to hearing your questions tonight and to again say that it's a joy to interact with Wyoming citizens as we explore together the meaning of the Constitution and advance our own knowledge about civic education. And I know that Matt will tell me when my 10 minutes are up. So thank you very much.
Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. Our question will begin with the Unit 1 question, and the Unit 1 of study for the We the People First unit is titled, What are the Philosophical and Historical Foundations of the American Political System? Students will answer 3 questions and write on 3 questions and defend that unit in the competition. We've selected one of the 3 state hearing questions for Dr. Adler to field. Our question is question 2. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution reads, quote, this Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. End quote. Why is the Constitution considered a higher law? What are the major characteristics of a higher law? How did the founders believe legitimate government was established? And how could higher law be used as a justification for a revolution? Please begin.
Thank you. The U.S. Constitution is considered the higher law in the United States precisely because Article 6 of the Constitution, known as the Supremacy Clause, provides that the Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So we have a clear textual statement in the Constitution that it is indeed the highest law in the land. And it represents an effort by the American people, the sovereign people, to establish a Constitution that reflects their views and values. The fundamental purpose of the Constitution, after all, was to reflect the interest of the people at the time of the founding, as reflected in the state ratifying conventions when we, the people, had the opportunity to put their stamp of approval on the U.S. Constitution. And that's so critical precisely because the very essence of American constitutionalism is that the people have a right to consent to a government of their choosing. That was essentially the fundamental point made in the Declaration of Independence, primarily written by Thomas Jefferson, who so eloquently said that the people have the right to form a government that reflects their views and values and exalts a government of their choosing. The American Constitution then is the higher law in a legal sense, but there's another tradition of the higher law that reflects the great philosophical sources of the American Constitution. And this would go primarily to the work of the great English philosopher named John Locke, who in 1691 wrote a book called The Second Treatise of Government. And it's in this book that Locke spells out the way in which a democratic or republican government is in fact formed. He posits the idea of a state of nature. We all live in a state of nature in which there are no gray buildings, no laws, no rules, certainly no governmental regulations. And life in the state of nature is pretty good. It's pretty good until a few people begin to exploit the mentally dull and the weaker amongst us, and then the people decide that there has to be a better way. So what the people do in this proverbial state of nature is to decide we're going to first create civil society, and then we're going to create government. So it's a 2-step process. The people then have the opportunity to write what we call a social contract, marking out the powers that they want to grant to government, the rights that they would enjoy under this social contract. And then they empower the government to do precisely what the people want them to do in the contract, to provide for defense, to ensure peace and tranquility, and to defend the rights of the people. And so this higher law background of the Constitution, about which scholars have written so eloquently, plumbs the depths of Anglo-American legal history and really provides the foundation for American thinking about the constitutional tradition. And the reality is that this document, the social contract, was highly useful to the Americans who founded our Constitution. Certainly Thomas Jefferson borrowed generously from the work of John Locke.
You're still good for time.
I'm still good for it. I heard that buzzer and I thought that was it. So when John Locke writes about the formation of the social contract, and the American thinkers are drawing upon a wide variety of sources, not merely Locke, but those who were out of power in England during the English civil wars in the mid-17th century, those whom we refer to as the dissenters, those who were on the losing side of the English Civil War, but very influential on the thinking of Americans, proposing the idea of constitutionally limited government, limiting sharply the powers of the executive, exalting the role and influence of the legislatures, all for the purpose of better representing the interest of the people. And so as it happened, John Locke was very influential in proposing this higher law background, and occasionally Americans like to draw upon John Locke in promoting their own interests and their own rights. But there's a crucial point to be made, and that is that while John Locke posited the idea of the right of the people to revolt, to overthrow government, when government grew tyrannical, ceased to serve the interests of the people, there was, in effect, no following, no adoption of that argument in our Constitution, because no organic document, as Abraham Lincoln said during the Civil War, could contain the seeds of its own destruction. And so the founders could not have conceived of the idea of writing into our Constitution a right to revolt. That was an idea that was powerful in the philosophy of natural rights when there was not a written constitution that had been approved by the people, delimited governmental power. It certainly was very useful to Tom Jefferson and the colonists who were rebelling against the mother country, because they were asserting that England was violating the rights of Americans and their natural rights. But it was of no moment at the time or the formation of the Constitution, because the framers were entitled to believe that they had created a system of government that would never again require the use of force to topple a government, precisely because of the right of the people to vote and to change those holding office. And so, rightly believing that they had established the rule of law, they had essentially prevented, again, the resort of the need to resort to violence, to change the government, and to preserve their rights. And so that becomes a very interesting and controversial point, as many Americans like to assert a right to overthrow the government, indeed a right to revolt. But we have to remember that using force against government is an exercise in treason, which is prohibited by the Constitution. And so what this really represents is the idea that foundational ideas at one point in time can be useful in writing constitutions and the laws of the land, and those same foundational ideas may once again be utilized to promote ideas that are aiming to make dramatic changes in our governmental system. Our students who study constitutional law will always remember that there has to be a constitutional right to overthrow the government if the legal argument is to be maintained. And in our Constitution, there's no such right, which leads us to say that the Magisterial Declaration of Independence, which was provided as the foundational document for our system, retains our allegiance. We admire it, we salute it, we revere it, but it is not the organic law of the land. The U.S. Constitution remains the supreme law of the land, as Article 6 states. Thank you.
Perfect. Any questions on that unit? Okay. Move to next question.
All right, Unit 2 is how did the framers create the Constitution? Question number 3. James Madison observed, quote, "It seems not to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interest lies not between the large and small, but between the northern and southern states. The institution of slavery and its consequences form the line of discrimination. What were the framers' views on slavery at the time of the Philadelphia Convention, and in what ways did the existence of slavery in the state shape the powers of Congress and the clauses of the Constitution, and which issues left unaddressed by the Philadelphia Convention are most relevant, are most relevant today?"
Thank you very much, Paula. The Constitution, of course, was drafted by delegates to the Philadelphia Convention in the summer of 1787, and it represented the effort of the sovereign people to write a constitution that would serve as the contract to delimit governmental power and represent their views and values about government. So beyond the act of writing what was simply a proposed constitution in 1787, that proposed constitution was then submitted to specially held state ratifying conventions, where delegates elected by their constituents to serve in those state ratifying conventions had the opportunity then to vote up or down on the proposed Constitution. It's important to remember that as a constitutional proposal, it might well have been defeated by the American people. In 1787, 1788, of course it was not. The American people approved it because they saw many reasons why it was superior to the governing document at that time, which was the Articles of Confederation. So when the American people had the opportunity to ratify, that is, approve of the Constitution, they were exercising their sovereignty, their power to state, this is the Constitution that we want to govern our nation. Now, one of the greatest issues in the convention that summer was the very difficult, indeed an intractably difficult issue, and that was slavery, because slavery pitted particularly the North against the South, and both parts of the country were wedded in their ways. It was particularly the case that Southern states had been so attached to the practice of slavery. It was their economic driver. It moved their engine. It was very important culturally. It was important socially. And so the Southerners were not about to give up slavery. Many in the North, that is, delegates from northern states, did in fact want to abolish slavery, but the abolitionists did not constitute a majority even from the northern states. This issue, as Ben Franklin said, would ultimately lead the nation to civil war. How prophetic. And the reality is that members of the North and South had to figure out how they were going to find a compromise on this issue of slavery, because the Southern delegates to the convention had made it crystal clear that if slavery was not preserved, they would leave the Constitutional Convention, and the aim of finding a constitution that could govern the nation more effectively than the Articles of Confederation would have been nullified. So what occurred in the process of long discussions and negotiations over the course of the summer of 1787 was an agreement principally crafted by South Carolina, aimed at the influential delegates from Massachusetts, that in fact slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person, less than a human being, 3/5 of a person. The South, of course, wanted to count slaves as a genuine human being for the purposes of representation, because the convention had already decided that representation in Congress would be based on population. So if the South could succeed in elevating the numerical value of a slave to a full person, then that would, of course, aid their representation in Congress and give the Southern states more clout. But the North said, you can't have your cake and eat it too. The reality is you don't count slaves as people. You're not going to be permitted to count them as slaves for purposes of representation. So they seized upon the 3/5 compromise, and that was helped by the Massachusetts delegates in the end, because they badly wanted the power over commerce, foreign and international, to be controlled by Congress. It would serve the interests of Massachusetts as a major port for all traffic abroad and internally. And one of the very famous members of the Constitutional Convention, Ben Franklin, said to the delegates, you are creating a deal with the devil. The reality is, without that compromise, the Southern delegates would have exited the convention and all the efforts would have gone for naught. Now, that didn't settle the question, because even though the Constitution provides that no slave could be imported after 1808, which the Northern delegates believed would bring an end to slavery at some point, apart from those that were going to be created in the United States, the ongoing contention and battle over the status of slavery would continue to fuel discussions and debates and ultimately lead to the Civil War, of course, because ultimately after a short time in the Civil War, Lincoln very much made it clear that the purpose of the Civil War was to end slavery. The issues of slavery, which we rightly call America's original sin, were never happily resolved in the Constitutional Convention and never resolved through the Civil War. and lingered on because, of course, the vestiges of slavery are to be found in race discrimination, which has plagued America from the beginning and necessitated not only the abolition of slavery, witnessed in the 13th Amendment ratified in 1865, but also the 14th and 15th Amendments, which combined with the 13th Amendment to form the Reconstruction Amendments, attempted to place blacks on par with whites in the eyes of the law. And the radical Republicans that controlled Congress in the aftermath of the Civil War were primed to push very hard to achieve precisely that goal. The 14th Amendment, for example, the magisterial clause that mimics the Declaration of Independence and attempts to effectuate the great goal of the Declaration of Independence, as so eloquently stated by Thomas Jefferson, that we're all created equal, is realized in the 14th Amendment sentence, which says, "No state shall make or enforce any law denying to any person the equal protection of the law, due process of laws, and privileges and immunities of citizenship." The 15th Amendment attempted to guarantee the right of the newly freed man to vote, to become a citizen and a full opportunity to participate in the great electoral choices and decisions in our country. If those Reconstruction Amendments had succeeded as the architects had intended, we might well have moved beyond the racism that plagued America from the beginning. But, of course, as you all know, we didn't, in part because the Supreme Court upheld efforts to deny full equal protection of the law and due process of law, and that led to the concretization of separate but equal in the infamous Jim Crow law in 1896. Left to segregation throughout the country, blacks were now simply second-class citizens, denied the full rights of the Reconstruction Amendments and indeed others. And of course that wasn't reversed, not even begun to be reversed until the Supreme Court finally in 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education held that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. So the great effort to fight discrimination, racial discrimination in our country, began with noble ideas in the Reconstruction Amendments. It took the court a long time to catch up with that sentiment, to attempt to effectuate the great goals of the Reconstruction Amendments. But of course, as you know, our nation continues to face and to try to confront adequately the problems of race discrimination. Thank you.
Any questions on that?
I will be reading from Unit 3, How has the Constitution been changed to further the ideals contained in the Declaration of Independence? And my question is number 1. Some constitutional scholars say that the Supreme Court should not find rights that are not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. They argue that the American people should amend the Constitution if they want to recognize certain rights. Do you agree or disagree? Why? Is the amendment process the best way to change the Constitution? What rights, if any, that are not yet recognized or formally recognized by the courts as having constitutional protection do you believe should be enumerated in the new amendments to the Constitution? Explain.
Great question from a future law student. Thank you very much. So this is a great question that goes to the heart of the way in which the Supreme Court operates, exercises its authority. It goes to the heart of the way the American people have the opportunity to exercise their popular sovereignty to change the fundamental law of the land through the amendatory clause. We can say at the outset that in fact the Constitution has attempted to implement the great goals of the Declaration of Independence primarily through the Reconstruction Amendments, but also through subsequent amendments that have served to democratize our nation, including, very importantly, the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote as a means of trying to promote genuinely the goal of equal protection of the law. One of the great questions confronting jurists, and certainly one that demands great attention from legal scholars and concerned citizens, is how the court interprets the Constitution when it comes to rights. Now, we all know, of course, that the Bill of Rights enumerates, that is, lists particular rights. And you can scan the Bill of Rights and you'll see enumerated in the First Amendment, for example, the right to free speech and freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and you would move down the list and you would see guarantees of due process of law and so forth. Enumerated rights can always be the subject of great controversy, of course, because the battles surround how are you going to interpret the enumerated rights? How are you going to determine how expansive the right is? How much regulation is permissible? What's unreasonable regulation? The battles then are familiar to us, and many of the great constitutional landmark cases are those battles that pit the effort of government to regulate activities versus the effort by individuals to assert their rights. Those are enumerated rights which are listed, and not without controversy. But more controversial, of course, are what we call unenumerated rights or implied rights, those not mentioned in the Constitution, but which are fairly and reasonably derived from enumerated rights. And you all participate in the exercise of some of those rights. Whenever you travel from city to city or state to state, you're asserting a right to travel, and you assume it's a fundamental right. But of course, that's not enumerated in the Constitution, and thus if we confined our jurisprudence to purely enumerated rights, you couldn't leave your city as a matter of right. You couldn't go from state to state as an enumerated right. Another example of an implied right would, of course, be freedom of association. You all are free to associate with friends and neighbors and colleagues. That's not an enumerated right. It's derived from the freedom of assembly. We think that it's reasonable to infer that as a matter of exercising freedom of assembly, you must first make the choice about whom you want to hang out with. And that is the exercise of freedom of association. So most Americans and every member of the Supreme Court historically, since the Bill of Rights became a subject before the court, would agree that there are unenumerated rights. Our jurisprudence has never distinguished in terms of stature or power between enumerated and unenumerated rights. While some citizens would like to say that unenumerated rights or implied rights are less significant, not worthy of the stature of an enumerated right spelled out in the Constitution, we don't have jurisprudence in our history that suggests such a distinction. Now, one of the great controversies of our time, and certainly in the current time, is how the court finds or discerns a particular right in the Constitution that's not enumerated, and this leads to considerable controversies. I like to tell my students that when an issue comes before the court asserting a right that many assume they enjoy, but is not spelled out, such as the right to privacy, what the court really has to do is to roll up its sleeve, dip its arm into the reservoir of rights, and ask ourselves, is a right to privacy reasonably inferred from rights that are enumerated? The court, for the first time in our history, stated the existence of such a right in 1965 in the landmark case of Griswold versus Connecticut, where the Supreme Court held that as a matter of right to privacy, marital couples have a right to access contraceptives. And that decision, written by Justice William O. Douglas, a Westerner from Washington, attempted to argue that the right to privacy is grounded in several provisions of the Constitution. Found it, for example, in the right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion, asserting, as the court had said in a 1943 landmark decision, West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett, authored in eloquent terms by Justice Robert Jackson, that there is, quote, this inner sanctum of the mind that is off limits to the government. When people think about their relationship to God, they contemplate their role in the universe, or they contemplate their thoughts about political issues and ideological beliefs. This is a little inner sanctum of the mind, which in a constitutional democracy is off limits to the government. And Jackson distinguished our system from the totalitarian systems against which we were fighting a war in World War II, and said in those countries, in totalitarian nations, The government has a right to tell people what they may think, what they may read, what they may believe, but we have a very sharp distinction here in our system from those totalitarian systems. So Justice Douglas, drawing on that opinion, found a right to privacy, as I say, in the religion and the free speech clauses. He found it in freedom of assembly. He went further. He found it in the Fourth Amendment, where Americans have the expectation of privacy in your homes, where we're protected against search and seizures unless they are well grounded. He found it in the Fifth Amendment, right against self-incrimination. You have a right to hold your tongue. He found it in the 14th Amendment liberty provision of the Due Process Clause, which states, no state shall make or enforce any law depriving any person of the right to due process without, the right to life, liberty, and property without due process of law. And he found it in the Ninth Amendment, which provides that the enumeration in this Constitution of certain rights shall not deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. And so he found that since time immemorial, people have had the expectation of a right to privacy. Now, that right to privacy would continue to be very controversial in its manifestations. That is, the way in which the Supreme Court would interpret it and apply it to areas of American life in which Americans believe they have a fundamental right to choose. Not only the right to access contraceptives, the right of women with respect to reproductive rights, to the LGBT community with respect to constitutional protection to engage in sexual activities, and of course same-sex marriage, and a whole lot of other issues. So the right to privacy remains controversial. But in fact, most people believe that they have a right to privacy, and we'll have a chance to come back to that later. So when the court is finding a right, discerning a right, identifying a right which is not enumerated, there will often be controversy, because people will say, maybe the court is simply creating a right rather than finding a right. And that's an important distinction in American law, because judges don't have any authority to create governmental powers any more than they have the authority to create rights. They have to find a power, find a right. Because if judges could create rights or powers, they would be engaging in the drafting of a new constitution, usurping not only legislative power, but ultimately the power of the sovereign people to amend the Constitution. And that's the last part of this question. Is it better for the American people to resort to the amendment of the Constitution if the Constitution needs to be updated? Some would advocate that, but that it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. We've only done it 27 times over 230 years. And the reality is that if we had to resort to the amendment of the Constitution every time it appeared to the nation that we needed to slightly alter it, then we might find that our Constitution is frail, brittle, way out of date. And so we rely on the courts to identify rights that can reasonably be inferred from those rights that are enumerated in the Constitution. But that's not to say that the American people have every right to push hard for changes in the Constitution. We've done that 27 times. And indeed, there are other proposed amendments that are circulating around the country, and which many Americans think are badly needed as a means of carrying on our constitutional tradition and expanding our democracy. And two of them, of course, are the Equal Rights Amendment, which many Americans believe is important because there still is gender discrimination in our country, widespread gender discrimination, in fact. And the second would be the D.C. Amendment, the proposed amendment that would give to American citizens living in Washington, D.C., voting representation in Congress, which they don't currently have. And the controversy surrounding the omission of a right to voting representation hinges on the fact that, as you all remember, the rallying cry of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. And yet, American citizens living in Washington, D.C., who bear the same obligations and and burdens of citizenship, who go to war, who pay their fair share of taxes, are being denied the very fundamental right that led American colonists to engage in revolution. And so people ask, is that fair or is it hypocritical? Thank you.
Any questions on that segment? Okay, please.
Good.
How do these unenumerated rights, can you repeat the question? How do these unenumerated rights square with the doctrine of originalism that seems to undergird the Dobbs case that overturned Roe?
Thank you, Judge, for that very important question. May I have 4 hours to adequately address and answer that? So the first part of that learned question asks, how does the doctrine of unenumerated rights square with the doctrine of originalism? The doctrine of originalism is the philosophy of constitutional interpretation that suggests that federal judges should in fact interpret the Constitution in light of the intentions of the framers, those who drafted the Constitution, on the premise that the American people ratified the Constitution that was presented to them, and that any deviation from that proposed Constitution would mark essentially a disregard for the fundamental right of the people to say, as James Iredell of the original Supreme Court said, we are governed by this particular division of responsibility, this particular division and allocation of powers. When we address that question of originalism, I think it's important to remember that it was none other than James Madison, the father of the Constitution and also the father of the Bill of Rights, who included in his proposed Bill of Rights the Ninth Amendment. And the Ninth Amendment provides that the enumeration in this Constitution of particular rights shall not be denied or disparaged by the very presence of these other rights. And so here was Madison making the argument textually, following his argument in the House of Representatives when he introduced the proposed Bill of Rights on June 9, 1791, and precisely because, if he said to his colleagues, if we don't include this Ninth Amendment to refer to other rights reserved to the people, then we will have to admit that the American people enjoy only those rights that are enumerated in this Constitution right now. And what if we, as a body, have forgotten or overlooked one or two? Then we would have to say those rights do not exist. And how ironic it was that in his lengthy list of rights, he had omitted a particularly interesting one, freedom of speech. Certainly he did not mean to omit that. His fellow Virginian, Mason, stood and said, my colleague certainly does not mean to omit this, and as a friendly amendment, I propose free speech. So Madison's omission, you see, proved his point, that other rights are available to the American people, and we have to protect the process that allows the courts, as an original doctrine, to find rights that are available in the Constitution. Of course, on the second part of the question, the Dobbs ruling by the Supreme Court at the end of its term this past June has proved to be very controversial, is firing the engine of partisan politics on both sides for the forthcoming midterm elections. And it goes right to that question of the validity of the Supreme Court's majority opinion written by Justice Samuel Alito, joined by a concurrence from Justice Clarence Thomas, both of whom scoffed at the idea of the right to privacy, dismissed the idea of substantive due process, which would mean that they dismissed the idea not only, obviously, of reproductive rights for women, which were derived from the original concept of privacy and the liberty provision in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, what we would refer to as substantive due process in Roe versus Wade in 1973. The court in Roe, as you know, identified a right to reproductive rights based on a right to privacy for women to govern their own reproductive organs as a matter of personal autonomy, as well as the liberty provision of the 14th Amendment. And the court hearkened back to the founding period, in which states permitted abortions up until the point of quickening, roughly 3 months. So it wasn't as though in Roe versus Wade that the court had created a right to abortion out of whole cloth. The court was merely reiterating the availability of a right that had been practiced at the state level at the founding of the country. But of course, with the majority opinion and the concurring opinion written by Justice Clarence Thomas, scoffing at the idea of a right to privacy, as Alito said, it's not enumerated in the Constitution, therefore it doesn't exist, even though, as we mentioned, Justice Alito and others would subscribe to the availability of unenumerated rights as witnessed in the right to travel and in the right to freedom of association, and also scoffed at the idea of substantive due process. That leads them, particularly Justice Thomas in his concurring opinion, to say that while the court in the Dobbs case was focused only on the issue of reproductive rights, he did allude to other Supreme Court decisions that rest on either the right to privacy or the liberty provision in the due process clause to create a substantive right, and he ticked them off. He listed them in his opinion, including the right to contraceptives adduced by the court in Griswold, certainly the right of members of the LGBT community to engage in the same sexual activities as heterosexuals, and of course the right to same-sex marriage, each of which has been referred to as a fundamental right by the Supreme Court on several occasions, particularly the Roe decision, by both Democratic and Republican nominees to the court, conservative and liberal nominees to the court. But what was interesting is Justice Thomas omitted reference to another important right that rests on substantive due process, and that is interracial marriage. He, of course, is a partner in interracial marriage, and so if he logically carried out his dismissal of the availability of substantive due process as justification for access to contraceptives and same-sex marriage, he would, to be consistent, also have to say that the very concept of the right to interracial marriage rests on that very weak read as well. And so controversy, of course, circulates around the Dobbs decision and the reasoning employed by the court. Thank you for that question.
Saul? Okay. Next question. Good.
Sally, please.
I'm embarrassed to ask why D.C. residents do not have the right to vote.
That's an excellent question. Thank you. And I think a lot of people wonder because they assume if you live in this country, you have a right to vote. The answer begins with the fact that when the District of Columbia was created, very few people actually lived in D.C. They lived in Virginia or they lived in Maryland, and people would come into the capital to work, and they would go home, and therefore they were represented by their congressional delegation, let's say, in the state of Maryland or in the state of Virginia. So they were not denied, and that's where they lived. But beginning in the early part of the 20th century, as more people moved to the District of Columbia to live where they work, and for other reasons, then this became an issue, because if they moved to the District of Columbia, no longer lived in Virginia or Maryland, then they didn't have any congressional delegates voting on their behalf. Congress changed the law later in the late 20th century to provide representation for D.C., but that person today is Eleanor Holmes Norton and has been for a very long time. She doesn't have the right to vote. So your representative is there listening, can speak, but you don't have the right to vote. And yet the right to vote, as we know, is critical, because without it, you can't indicate where you stand on proposals. So the effort to grant residents of D.C. Voting representation has grown and enjoys greater momentum now as Americans come, I think, more widely to understand that this is a fundamental denial of a basic right. to American citizens, the right to representation. And this was, of course, the rallying cry in the American Revolution. Now, the reality is some will very candidly oppose the creation of a D.C. amendment. Some U.S. senators speaking very candidly, and I recall even in the late 70s that a syndicated columnist, James K. Kilpatrick, who is a widely syndicated columnist, you might have recalled reading his columns or seeing him on the early days of 60 Minutes debating a liberal counterpart. And when the question was, why would he oppose it, or why would his party, his Republican, oppose the D.C. amendment, he said candidly, everybody knows that the 2 senators elected from Washington, D.C. will be black, urban, and liberal. And he said, because of the population being principally African American. He said, just leaving aside the issue of race for a moment, Republicans would not want a senator who is liberal and has an urban orientation, because that would lead them to support policies that might not play well in rural states. So he was candidly stating what other Republican senators have said many times, including the junior senator from Idaho, Jim Risch, who would say, I would never want senators from D.C. because then Republicans would never again govern the U.S. Senate. So they are asserting their own political interests ahead of what many people would regard as the fundamental right to vote. Because what happens if you're a citizen in a democracy and you don't have the right to vote? And by contrast, suddenly Wyoming residents could ask themselves, what if tomorrow we lost our voting rights in Congress? Nobody to assert Western interests or Wyoming's specific interests, water rights. And yet we had to pay taxes, we had to go to war, had to bear all the obligations and burdens of citizenship. Would we feel that unfair? That would be the same question to ask about the denial of voting representation to our fellow citizens in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Thank you. With regard to this question about changing the Constitution, Article 5 proposes 2 ways to amend the Constitution. We've only used the first. There is a push, however, to use the second method, and that is that 2/3 of the state legislatures could call for a new constitutional convention. Could you talk about that a little bit, what it might mean and the possibility of whether that would happen?
Yes, thank you very much, Maggie. That's really an important question, because you're quite right in identifying a growing momentum, particularly within certain ideological groupings and in particular states, for America to host a second constitutional convention at which various proposals could be considered to, in fact, change our Constitution. For years, many Americans have wanted a balanced budget amendment, for example. For years, many Americans have wanted the ERA introduced and supported, the Equal Rights Amendment. And so there are a variety of proposals. On the one hand, you would say, if you really believe in the right of the sovereign people to amend the Constitution, exercising their sovereignty, you would say, let's not be afraid of a second constitutional convention, because we the people have a right to gather and propose amendments, always remembering, of course, that whatever is proposed still has to be approved in the second stage, the ratification stage. But of course, many Americans also fear the kinds of proposals that might be introduced. Would there be wild-eyed ideas, for example, to overturn the 17th Amendment, which some candidates running for the U.S. Senate this very election have advocated? It's the 17th Amendment that was ratified in 1913 that gave to the American people the right to directly elect their own U.S. senators, which had, of course, amended the original Constitution in which states had the authority to select U.S. senators. So we say the 17th Amendment help to overcome deep-seated corruption at the state level, and to expand democratic opportunities. Some worry about that. Some have maintained that the 14th Amendment should be repealed. And so there are a variety of ideas then that have been floating around, which some people obviously advocate for, but others fear what might come out of that convention. And in light of the rise of extremism in America, some people who had kind of straddled the fence on this issue of a second constitutional convention now say that their fear of what might come now overbalances their interest in a second constitutional convention. Thanks for asking. Yeah.
Dr. Adler, the next question is from Unit 4. How have the values and principles embodied in the Constitution shaped American institution and practices? It's question 1. What are the major functions of the House of Representatives and the Senate? What institutional checks exist between the two chambers? How has political polarization influenced the function of Congress? To what extent have political compromises overcome political differences? And which do you think has the most influence on a congressional representative? The interests of their constituents, party leadership, or ideology, and why?
Thank you. No controversies in this question, are there? The first part is pretty easy, and we can say if you look at Article 1 of the Constitution, which is known as the legislative article because it enumerates congressional powers, we would find that, as James Madison explained in the Federalist Papers, that the legislature in a republic necessarily predominates. And so most governmental powers are granted to Congress. The powers granted to the presidency are few and meager in comparison. Same holds true for the judiciary. So Congress is given very broad authority as the first branch of government to govern our republic. It begins with, of course, the broad lawmaking power of Congress. The first sentence says, all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in Congress. The legislative power is a synonym for the lawmaking power. And Congress has very broad authority to legislate in our nation. It is, of course, a power that is limited by the Bill of Rights. So if we took a quick look at the Bill of Rights, just the First Amendment, it says, for example, Congress shall make no law abridging free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. So we know that Congress cannot legislate in a way that would deprive or indeed abridge our rights to engage in freedom of religion, freedom of speech. So the Bill of Rights acts to limit the very broad authority vested in Congress. Congress can also not pass laws that impose bills of attainder or ex post facto laws. And there are a variety of limitations then imposed on Congress. But yet the congressional authority is very broad, as the Supreme Court has held numerous times throughout our history, and that legislative power, moreover, includes the very valuable and important tool of Congress to conduct hearings, to conduct investigations, so that it can inform itself and inform the nation about how laws are working or how laws are not being properly administered, and what laws need to be added to the U.S. statutes. So this role is so important that President Woodrow Wilson once wrote, when he was Professor Woodrow Wilson at Princeton, that the informing function is as important as the lawmaking function. Indeed, if Congress could not gather information, including the power to compel people to come testify to various committee hearings, then it would be left in the dark. And it would be writing laws and trying to create programs, casting about in the dark, devoid of information. And you all know how valuable in your own personal lives it is to have as much information as you can access before you make important decisions in your life. Same for Congress. And so the investigatory power, which has lately been on page 1 of our newspapers now for many months, including the work of the January 6th committee investigating the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, has become riveting television drama as testimony from Trump administration officials, Trump supporters, have brought to the January 6th committee insights revelations, disclosures about the plans behind that day and other plans to essentially subvert the election. And we all know how controversial that is. But it's a very, very important function, because without the ability to collect information, to improve the laws of the land, then Congress would lack both the authority to hold the executive accountable, but also to legislate going forward to protect the nation against other kinds of efforts. So the lawmaking function and the authority to inform itself, which carries with it the authority to hold hearings, to compel people to testify through issuing subpoenas, and other means and methods, are very important, very vital to the exercise of a long list of congressional powers. If you also look at Article 1 to determine the width and breadth of congressional powers, you'd see that Congress is granted complete authority over foreign commerce and broad authority over interstate commerce. And through a series of Supreme Court decisions over 200 years, the authority of Congress over interstate commerce has grown and grown and grown. Beyond governing domestically, you might be interested in knowing, Congress has granted the lion's share of American foreign policy powers, more powers than those granted to the president, whom Americans would typically identify as the prime mover of American foreign policy. The framers, however, granted the greatest, the most awesome power to Congress, and that is the power to decide to take the nation into war, to declare full-blown total war, or to authorize limited hostilities. That reflects the fact that the framers, to a man, were opposed to the idea of giving the war power to a single person, precisely because they had witnessed over history how kings and despots and other executives had taken their nations to war, not for the interest of the populace, but for their own personal or pecuniary or political interests. And so the war power is granted to the Congress, not the president. In addition to that, Congress is given very broad authorities to govern American foreign policy. And some powers are shared between the president and the Senate. So we're familiar with the fact that the treaty-making power is shared by the president and the Senate. At no point in the Constitutional Convention did the framers ever consider making the president the senior partner in the conduct of American foreign policy. This is one of those areas where historical practice by presidents of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, have tipped the Constitution upside down. Congress then has very broad authority. We're also asked, how does the system of checks and balances work? Well, the Constitution, of course, enlists the assistance of numerous checks and balances as they pertain to congressional power. Consider that any bill passed by the House has to be approved by the Senate. There's a check and balance. Any bill that Congress passes is presented to the president for his signature or veto. There's a check and balance. The appointment power, including the appointment of judges to the federal bench, is also checked and balanced by virtue of the fact the president nominates, and then the Senate has the authority to grant its advice and consent, including the decision to reject a presidential nominee, which has happened in roughly 20% of the nominations of federal judges in our history, not very often. And so the appointment power to cabinet posts and for ambassadors, that too is checked and balanced by the shared arrangement between the president and the Senate. So checks and balances work both internally, that is within Congress, and externally through the partner, that would be the president. One of the great parts of this question is to ask whether or not, in one way or another, compromise is even possible any longer in this great period of extreme polarization. And we have witnessed the difficulty of somehow bringing the two parties together to engage in compromise, because we often say that compromise is the engine of American democracy, but if the two sides are so far apart, they are polarized and unwilling to compromise, then we ask ourselves, how can we create an effective functioning government to address the great issues of our time? And of course, many Americans are frustrated by the fact that Congress can't seem to do that. Now the question asks, well, what are the guiding motives? What are the difficulties behind this inability to find compromise? Is it party allegiance? Is it ideology? Is it serving the interests of the constituents? It's all of the above. But the principal problem, in my opinion, is that too many members of Congress are particularly interested in their own longevity. This is called the problem of careerism, that members of Congress in both parties for many, many years have been primarily interested in remaining in Congress, which affects and influences the way they cast their votes. They don't want to jeopardize their positions with their constituents back home, so this is an influence, constituents. But it also means that they're not going to stake out a position on an issue. Often, you may know this from experience, you may know that oftentimes our representatives really won't be very clear with we the voters on where they stand on the issues for fear of alienating some supporters. So they resort to the use of weasel words. So we really, that's a technical term, by the way. We really don't know where they stand on issues. And then, of course, many members of the House and the Senate avoid the town hall meetings that are so important to remain connected with the voters and to inform the voters. The framers believed that frequent elections would protect us against tyranny and it would hold government accountable. And they all practiced and deeply believed in the idea of town hall meetings where members of the House and the Senate would come before the electorate, give a speech, and then answer questions, because this way we voters know where they stand and they would have to explain themselves. And the voters then could say to themselves, well, if my representative can't really adequately explain why he or she voted for this bill and can't adequately explain their reasoning on this issue, maybe I should look for another candidate. But as much as candidates can muddle their voting record, avoid answering questions, even showing up at town hall meetings, they are in effect insulated from the American people who deeply yearn for information and want to hold them accountable, because in our constitutional system, as James Madison said, the first feature is accountability. Thank you.
Hey, we're going to change up the question for Unit 5.
I love it.
Okay.
This is getting tricky now.
Yeah.
Sounds challenging.
Unit 5 covers what rights does the Bill of Rights protect? Question number 3. The liberty of the press is essential to the security of freedom in a state. It ought not therefore to be restrained in this Commonwealth. Many of the first state constitutions specifically protect freedom of the press. Why was the protection of a free press so important to the framers? Are different types of media treated differently under the First Amendment today? Why and why not? How, if all, do you think this government or the government should strike the balance between protecting the freedom of the press and preventing the spread of fake news?
This is a wonderful question, one that resonates in our time, certainly. The founders deeply believed in freedom of the press. Even though almost all members of the Constitutional Convention and an early session of Congress would be very angry at articles that they read in newspapers that attacked them, and of course they would use the usual language, this is unfair, for example, and inaccurate. But despite those occasional criticisms, they had a deep, fervent belief in freedom of the press. Now, why was that? It was so eloquently stated by Thomas Jefferson that freedom of the press is actually more important than freedom of speech. That might leave us to wonder how that can be true, because we Americans are fond of engaging in intense discussions and debates, exercising our right to free speech. But the reason why the founders, as stated by Jefferson, so deeply believed in the importance of freedom of the press is this. In a republic, the citizenry must be informed. It has to be informed about governmental activities, because if we voters are not informed, how do we know how to judge the government? How can we possibly critique governmental programs? How can we possibly offer our own suggestions and advice? And ultimately, how can we hold government accountable? Our founders had learned from ancient practices of censorship going all the way back to Athens that if the government is not the subject of reporting, is not the subject of a system that reflects what the government is doing, then the government is in charge of information, and it can spoon feed the citizenry that information which serves its own purpose. And we know, of course, that if you can control the information that is disseminated to the American people, then you can control public opinion. And ultimately, public opinion is the great tempering tool to hold government accountable. So if you can withhold information from the American people, you have a great opportunity to remain in power. So freedom of the press, as the founders believe, was critical. Doesn't mean that they necessarily believe that a free press would always be an accurate press. Nobody would be so foolish to say that. And so the reality is that we're often fired up, angered by certain stories that might appear in different media outlets as not accurately reflecting the story of the time. Newspaper reporters subscribe to and practice the journalistic code of ethics, the professional journalistic code of ethics, which in one way or another means they have an obligation to try their very best to accurately report the event that they're covering. And there are good reasons to believe that reporters across the board, with some exceptions, will adhere to those canons of journalistic ethics, because at truly professional newspapers, if you write an inaccurate story, once the editors see it, you'll be reprimanded. If you deliberately try to distort the facts, you could be fired. And no reporter wants to be fired. This is their career. Obviously, reporters, as you may know, don't enter journalism for the money. They're paid at about the impoverished level of teachers, and sometimes worse. There's a pitch for paying teachers better. So the reality is they do it because they have a professional commitment to informing the public. Now, the bright side of the industry, known as journalism, can be seen in its professional practice of correcting its own errors. You may read newspapers where on occasion you'll find the paper is issuing a retraction, and it is saying, we reported yesterday thus and such, but that was not wholly accurate. This is the accurate report. Now, I admire a professional industry that will own up to its mistakes. And you could all ask yourselves, what other profession actually owns up to its mistakes? I can't think offhand of too many doctors who will say, I killed the patient, too many lawyers who would admit to malpractice, or judges admitting that they made errors, present company accepted. The reality is that newspapering is an admirable profession because it often does acknowledge its errors. And that instills confidence in the American people that what they are reading is in fact the straight stuff, the straight gin. So the reality is that we rely on newspapers, as the founders said, to gather information. And it's far better for the American citizenry to read newspaper stories written by professionally trained journalists who have it as a goal to provide that information. I will say, as a former journalist, that I have it in my DNA to want to believe in the importance of the free press, and indeed the overall aim of most reporters to, in fact, provide accurate stories. Occasionally, of course, I'm asked, well, are all media outlets accurate, and are they reliable? And of course, the answer would be no. And so you would search for those news sources that you find to be reliable, and then you could hope to be getting the straight stuff about our government at any level. Now the question is, one of the questions here, is whether or not the government should intervene to do what it can to control disinformation. We learned more than we ever cared to know about the role of disinformation in the presidential campaign of 2016, and it continues in different parts of the country at different levels in different races. Disinformation is a great evil here in America. It inflicts a peculiar harm because whereas Jefferson and the others said we want accurate story, we want to know the facts, we want to know the truth, we want evidence where it can be ascertained, disinformation is exactly the opposite. It is a deliberate effort to distort the facts, a deliberate effort to mislead the American people. And again, if we are misled, if we're not given the straight stuff, then how can we be in the position of accurately, of critiquing governmental programs, policies, and laws? We're denied the opportunity to engage in our great roles as participatory citizens. So that's very important. But what should the government do with social media, such as Facebook, for example? There's been a lot of controversy about governmental regulation, and people are split. I certainly don't want social media to mislead the American people. It can inflict great harm. But I don't want the government to engage in acts of censorship to allow or to prohibit private companies from providing information. What does that mean then as a practical alternative? It means that various organizations can create their own means of disseminating information to the American voters, and we hope that in the spirit of the marketplace of ideas that we would have good competition and the American people would in fact learn to trust certain outlets, Facebook or others, or not Facebook or others, as being purveyors of accurate information. If it happens that the government has no way to control the dissemination of disinformation, then we have to look harder at, if we say that it's hard for our country to control and to limit and to police through private individual means or collective means the disinformation campaigns on social media, then maybe we'll have to consider next steps. But at this point, I'm certainly not an advocate of governmental intervention. At some point, you have to trust the American people and their judgment. You have to trust the American people in believing that we are interested in acquiring accurate information, that in the spirit of the Enlightenment, then in fact, we would want to access the truth and facts and evidence to guide our decisions. That was the hope of the founders, and I don't want to abandon the hope of democracy, which relies on American people. I, like you, can be very disappointed in the judgments made by my fellow Americans, but the process, it seems to me, is very important. I've never been a fan of censorship, and I'm not now one. Thank you.
We call that, in the We the People, the Citizen, and the Constitution, we gave a journalist a softball question about the free press. We have time for one more prompt, and Sydney, if you'd read that, please.
So this is from Unit 6. What challenges might face American constitutional democracy in the 21st century? And the question is number 2. At the Philadelphia Convention, the framers established rules to promote civil discourse, including limiting how often one could speak, ensuring that attention was focused on the speaker, and allowing for the reconsideration of any decisions. How did this promote civil discourse at the convention? What rules would be necessary today to promote civil discourse in government? And what, if anything, needs to be done to promote and improve civil discourse in the media and public life?
That's a great question, and it goes to an issue of great concern for our nation at this time. The first thing to note is that in the Constitutional Convention, the framers adopted a rule to promote civil discourse and reconsideration of issues at any point in time. The first thing to note is that the framers agreed that no issue was dead for purposes of discussion. No issue was finally settled for purposes of discussion or voting until the convention adjourned. The reason behind that was that as the framers discussed and debated more aspects of the system they were creating, they would realize that some issue that they were exploring might in fact shed light on a previous issue about which they may have confidently decided. But after learning or acquiring more information, they could say, well, wait a minute, we need to go back and reconsider this issue. The virtue of that is it continued to characterize the convention as an ongoing academic seminar where all issues could be discussed and debated through civil discourse. That was the key. And that meant that, of course, rules were enforced, that people who were out of line would be told to sit down, often by George Washington as the presiding officer. But there was a spirit among the delegates that suggested, in fact, that if they wanted to wield any influence, they would not engage in angry outbursts, that they would not, in fact, speak over their colleagues, because they themselves would lose their influence in the course of the proceedings. There's not to say, of course, that many controversial ideas serve to undermine the influence of particular framers. Some, for example, on June 19th, had proposed the idea that because of rising tensions, that maybe they should resort to a daily prayer. At that point, Alexander Hamilton of New York stood up and said, quote, "These proceedings are in no need of foreign intervention," and they defeated it. That's how Hamilton referred to it. A little witty, maybe, outrageous to some. The reality here is that the convention also closed its doors and windows during their proceedings, because they knew that whatever they proposed would be the subject of considerable debate during the ratification debates, and they did not need to provide their opponents with ammunition, because they would so thoroughly discuss the ins and outs of the issues that were under consideration that they didn't need to have people on the outside of the convention taking notes, so they would always have ammunition to fire back at the proposals made by the framers. The framers believed deeply in civil discourse, but that's not to say that they could always, as participants in American politics, rise above accusations and even violence. It was a code of behavior that the framers hoped would be practiced and emulated. And we understand that in our time, if we are to satisfactorily address the great issues, that we have to be able to speak to one another. And that includes listening. It means abandoning certain techniques that would foreclose discussion and debate. It would mean abandoning certain techniques that would undermine the very idea of considered discussion and debate. So, for example, it does not serve our interests well if we resort to branding or labeling our opponents as socialists. It doesn't mean that we advance discussion if we misrepresent a person's line of thought. It's far better for us to accurately represent what our opponent is saying, and so that we could then have a serious discussion. Distortion doesn't serve an interest. As fun as it may be, and as easy as it may be to want to distort our opponent's position, to turn that into a skeleton of an argument so we can win, that doesn't advance discourse at all. We also want to remember, in the spirit of civil discourse, that half a loaf is better than none, a spirit which encourages us to compromise, to win as much as we can on a particular issue at a particular time, and come back to that issue at another juncture. It also means that we don't treat politics as war, because that's not at all consistent with civil discourse. If you try to destroy your opponent to win an argument, you're not likely ever to enjoy that opponent's support again, and that undermines what we should understand, that in a democracy, politics is fluid. That is, views and values can change, and that while we might want to win an argument, win a position on an issue, the way of destruction is not a way to promote civil discourse. So there are techniques that people like to resort to win. Civil discourse, of course, can reflect an exercise in our civil liberties, such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. But there is a profound distinction between resorting to constitutionally protected freedoms, which are nonviolent, and the resort to violent means as a means to bring down a government or to change policies or to prevent another party from coming to power. Those are forbidden in our system. The reality is civil discourse can be promoted by the American people if we are committed to the idea that a democracy hinges on honest discussion and debate, and that we may not win all the time. We may lose on issues that are very important to us, but it's the process that is important. We can't distort the process or destroy the process, because if we destroy the process, then it's not there for us when we hope to prevail by resort to facts and truths and evidence. So as difficult as it may be, the exercise in a democracy of our responsibilities as citizens requires some restraint. It requires some commitment to the great values of our democracy. And it's a lesson that our students can learn and do learn through the We the People program, which is the greatest program for teaching the Constitution and the values and virtues of our democracy. But it should not end when people graduate. People beyond the school years should in fact have an opportunity to continue their educational process and to participate in our democratic system in a meaningful, well-informed manner. Anything less undermines the great goals and the virtues and values of our system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adler. And as we're closing in on the end of the evening, I want to open it up to any questions on any topics that you might have before we let Dave have some final remarks and Sean to close the program. So if my colleagues at the panel or anyone else has any question on any topic. Bill.
Please.
Okay, here's a cutting edge question that's raging amongst some of us in the Wyoming State Bar right now. So on Monday, 41 Wyoming lawyers wrote, and retired judges wrote to Harriet Hageman, who's running for Congress, as you know, based upon her remarks in Casper on August 3rd at a televised event in which she said absolutely the presidential election was rigged. It was rigged to ensure that Donald Trump could not win. It was a travesty. It should never happen again. We need free and fair elections. Classic political speech in the public forum, clearly protected by the First Amendment in the most robust way. However, Harriet Hageman is a Wyoming lawyer who took an oath, like all of us, to defend and obey the Constitution and to support the rule of law and to honestly comply with the obligations of being an attorney in Wyoming, which includes complying with the Wyoming rules of professional conduct, which prevent lawyers from engaging in conduct that is dishonest, misleading, that denigrates public officials, judges, the administration of justice, etc. A whole set of rules which can subject a lawyer to discipline by the Wyoming State Bar. So she's not the only lawyer in the country that is spouting election denialism in a very matter-of-fact way, not an expression of opinion. The election was rigged, absolutely, is what she said. And so the debate has been, is that a matter that the Wyoming State Bar should sanction her for? Of course, that's up to the Wyoming State Bar. There was a lot of feeling that that's protected speech. We believe in the First Amendment as much as we believe in lawyers telling the truth or telling lies, or so 41 of us just wrote her a letter and said what you did was wrong as a lawyer, as a Wyoming lawyer, and we pointed out the ways. I'd be interested in your thoughts about this, because as I said, she's not the only lawyer saying this. It's sort of rampant across the country. There are bar associations dealing with this very issue. Rudy Giuliani was suspended from practicing law. He said a lot more than Harriet Hageman said, and he said it in court, which is why probably he was suspended. But I'd be curious on your take on the interplay between the First Amendment and the, state governments give our bar associations the authority to regulate the profession for the protection of the public. And so I think several of us in the audience would be interested in your comments about this.
Thank you. I appreciate that question. It's a very important question. The first thing to note is a statement of fact. The election deniers are wrong, clearly wrong, wholly wrong. There was, in effect, no significant fraud in the election that threw the victory to Joe Biden. 62 courts, some combination of state and federal courts, held that they could not find any evidence of fraud that would have altered the election. And some of the judges who rendered that ruling were in fact appointees by former President Donald Trump. The reality is that the attorneys in those cases did not identify to any of the courts any evidence of fraud, even though they would often stand on the steps of the courthouse door to speak freely to the American people and contend that there was widespread fraud. But they did not a single instance of any person other than Giuliani saying that to a court, because for the reasons as you indicated, they could lose their license or suffer a lesser penalty. So that's why the lawyers arguing those cases on behalf of the former president were in fact disingenuous. They were telling the American public the election was rigged and fraudulent, but they would never say that in a court of law because they wanted to continue practicing law. Now that's very important, because by their own silence, by their own refusal to argue evidence that would distort the factual, that would distort the facts, they knew that they were governed by the code of professional responsibility. In my view, lawyers are not released from that profoundly important role governing their conduct once they're out of the court or anywhere in the country, because lawyers play a special role in our system. Indeed, the lawyers and judges have played a very important role in promoting the rule of law and American constitutionalism. And part of that is that they will adhere to the code of professional conduct. If a private person who is a lawyer goes out on the campaign hustings or anywhere else and deliberately deceives the audience, engages in a lie, they are truly exercising their right to free speech. However, having become a licensed lawyer does not mean that they can use their right to free speech to violate that code of professional conduct. In effect, when you became an attorney and you met the terms to win a license to practice law, you were acknowledging, stating, affirming that oath that you took to essentially avoid engaging in lies publicly. Otherwise, of course, that would, if you could do that, that would render the professional code of ethics inoperable. It would mean nothing, because attorneys would be free to mislead the public by lying at any turn. It's particularly important for a congressional candidate or a candidate for any office to adhere to that particular code, to that affirmation, because of the high office they are seeking. If they can, in fact, freely and willingly lie to the public about an issue of such grave importance as the assertion of fraud for the highest office in the land, and then proceed to win and continue to engage in the perpetration, in the perpetuation of that lie and fraud, they are doing not only a grave disservice to their constituents, but to the country, and also, of course, to their professional obligations. And so Ms. Hageman is not the only candidate who does that. A candidate to become Attorney General in the state of Idaho is in fact an election denier. We have a slate of candidates running for the office of Secretary of State across the country who are election deniers, and other candidates running for the United States Senate, many of whom are lawyers. So how do you reinforce that code of professional conduct? The only way to make that real and viable and to hold these lawyers accountable is indeed for the Bar Association to discipline them, whether that's a reprimand or indeed the higher step of removing their license to practice law, as it happened in the case of Rudy Giuliani. Bill Clinton, the former president, was stripped of his law license when it became obvious that he had misled the court in a case in which he was accused, the Paula Jones case, accused of sexual harassment. So the Arkansas bar stripped a former president of his law license because he had lied in court to a grand jury, used his public position with all the power and stature of being a former president to mislead the nation. If you can strip a former president, and I think this is a very important issue for our time and other matters, if you can strip a former president, then there's no reason not to strip a current candidate for violating the professional code of ethics. Thank you for that question. There may be follow-ups.
I hope you have an opportunity to discuss this topic tomorrow night.
I would look forward to it, and I certainly will if a question is raised by somebody in the audience. Perhaps you might know somebody.
Jim Belcher, you have a question?
Dr. Adler, Judge Day mentioned Justice Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion in the Dobbs decision.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, so he makes reference to these non-enumerated rights that the U.S. Supreme Court has found in various decisions, excluding, as you mentioned, interracial marriage, which happens to be fairly personal to him. In your experience in looking at Supreme Court decisions, have you seen any similar type concurrences or mentions by any Supreme Court justice that's indicated that legal issues like that should be brought before them?
That's a very fine question. It's a very important question. The answer is no. In my experience, this is unprecedented. We have seen other judges, in their opinions, say, for example, that if a case has been erroneously decided, the court should consider rehearing the issues, but never spelling out any particular issues that should be heard. In other words, no invitation to attorneys or litigants to bring that issue or that case before the court. No effort to engage in shopping, we might say. It was the case, it was familiar, that former Chief Justice Rehnquist used to give talks around the country and would encourage people to bring lawsuits challenging Roe versus Wade. That was off the bench, ex cathedra, we would say, but no opinion in which we have a justice inviting litigation to reconsider. And then, obviously, in my view, deeply personal, somewhat hypocritical way to say that all these other fundamental rights that rest on substantive due process or the right to privacy should be reexamined, but not the fundamental right that gave Thomas the right to marry a white woman, which, if Loving versus Virginia in 1968 had not been rendered, creating a constitutional right to interracial marriage, Clarence Thomas and Ginny Thomas never could have been married. So it is, in my view, offensive to the country for a Supreme Court justice to omit the very a fundamental right from which he is on which he benefits, which rests on the very right that he would attack to deny tens of millions of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, who have accessed contraceptives, for example. Yeah. There's much controversy surrounding Justice Thomas and his wife, Ginny, with her political activities these days.
One more, I hope this question's short. So I believe Lindsey Graham introduced or said he was going to introduce federal legislation to make abortion illegal except for certain things. So we're talking about the supremacy clause on one hand, whereas the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that it's a states' rights issue under the Dobbs decision, if I understand that correctly. So would the federal legislation be unconstitutional because it would trump state law?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think many ask that question. I think if Congress were to pass a law that prohibits all abortions except in rare conditions, that would in fact trump state laws because of the supremacy clause, because the court in the Dobbs case does say the issue should be resolved by the states, but it stops short of saying it is a state power to rule on abortion, just recommending that as a preferred approach. If we had a lawsuit, then the issue would be very interesting for the precise reason that you raised, Jim, because under state constitutions, as we know, states have greater authority to protect rights than the Congress would under a state constitution. So if Congress passed such a law, and I would say either passes a law to prohibit all abortions or perhaps a law that would essentially codify Roe versus Wade, that raises a question deep-seated in federalism, and this court might well say, without having said in the Dobbs case, this court might well say this is a state matter to decide, striking down an effort by Congress to pass a law which many believe should rest on the supremacy clause. That would usher in a potential line of cases, turning back the clock way, way back, in which state powers would trump federal law, reverse federalism. Who knows where this Supreme Court is heading? But I would say that this court is pretty full of itself and engaging in very clear acts of conservative judicial activism. Thank you. That's an important question.
Dr. Adler, any final closing remarks before Sean ends our evening?
Thank you. Just very briefly, I've very much enjoyed the opportunity to respond to these important questions that students in Wyoming and across the nation will be addressing. No doubt they're going to do a better job than I did. But I also want to say I really enjoyed your questions tonight and the exchange that we've had. And it's this opportunity to engage in a town hall exchange is very much what the founders of our nation anticipated, so that the public could meet public officials, or scholars and others would have the opportunity to meet the public and exchange views, all in the name of engaging in civil discourse that best serves our democracy. And so we should all be vigilant in our efforts to protect this very important right, and at all events, as James Madison said in Federalist 51, to hold government accountable. If we lose governmental accountability, then we lose a primary feature of the rule of law, which sustains American constitutionalism and our democracy. And so we can't lose the rule of law. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Good. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here. I started off with the Declaration of Independence, and I might end with it. I feel even this conversation tonight, the statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident, we may not all be holding the same truths self-evident. And it is really going to be the burden and the opportunity for Sydney and her generation to understand, how do we come together to be able to tackle complex problems in a thoughtful way. And Like tonight's discussion, like we the people, like a good civics education, that necessitates an understanding of the philosophical and historical underpinnings of our government and Constitution, understanding of how the Constitution was created, how it changes over time, what are the values and principles embodied in it, and what are those challenges that we collectively must face. Dr. Adler, we appreciate your perspective. And as your call to action, this conversation can't be all, because these are complicated topics. So thank you in advance to all of the audience for doing your part in continuing to educate yourself and hearing different perspectives. Thank you to the We the People program. Thank you to Mrs. Volker for teaching civics to our next generation. And thank you, Sydney, for being part of our constitutional future. So thank you all, and have a good night.